Good evening. My name is Michael Hodges. I'm here with Duff Crerar, and tonight is going to be the first night in a series on answering tough questions. Tonight and this week and for next week, we'll be answering a particular one on, is the Bible reliable? In part, this question came up because of my story, and I'll tell you a little bit about it before Duff starts talking. A while ago, I went to a Bible college, and I took a course on Greek, reading the New Testament in Greek, and learning about a little bit about the history of the Bible. In this course, I learned about how we got it, and some of the challenges in how we got the Bible. And I learned things that I'd never heard before, and it troubled me greatly. I believe, Jesus is the Son of God. I believe in being a good Christian. I believe in salvation, and I believe that when I read the Bible, I want to live in what it tells me how to live. But in this course, I learned that we don't actually have any of the original manuscripts, or hardly any of the original manuscripts in which the Bible is written. Also, the translation that we're holding, even the Greek translation, is copies of copies of copies, and many of these copies disagree with each other, and there's debates on what it actually says. And this troubled me because I wanted to live to be a good Christian. I wanted to do what the Bible told me, but now I doubted that I was reading the Bible at all. What if I wasn't reading what they originally wrote? And so this troubled me greatly. Can I be a Christian? Is how the Bible is describing how to be a Christian, is that Christian at all? And it was a big challenge to my faith. So I spent a number of years finding answers to those questions. And for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking through some of these tough questions about how the Bible came to be, and is it reliable, what we're reading? And so I'll turn it over to Duff. Hello, Duff.
My story builds a little bit on Mike's and is a bit like Mike's, in that when I was in second year at university, I encountered a whole new level of scholarship around the ancient world. And I got to the ancient world by studying Latin, Roman history, Greek history, and then Mesopotamian history, ancient philosophy. So you might say that I came into the Bible studies through the secular door, through the worldly door, and encountered a massive wall of scholarship, repeated assertions by different scholars about the unreliability, the recent composition, the chaotic nature of studies, strange references to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are really interestingly entitled. They're not dead. There's no ocean there, and they're not even scrolls, all of them, but nevertheless overturned a long series of assumptions. And since then, as I've kept track of it, a wave of archaeological research and a reinterpretation of some of these ancient texts. So my mind was being expanded, rearranged, and it led me on a lifelong search to pursue aspects of the history of the Bible, how we got it, what it is, and what it isn't. And in particular, looking at the way in which the Bible touches history. And so what I want to focus on while we're here is the actual Bible itself and its history. The Bible has a history. It has a biography. It has a lot of different parts that have their story, each of them. Probably first of all, when we look at the Bible, we tend to think of it as a book written with a single hand or written through a single eye. And it's just not the case. It's a library. The Bible is a collection of books, probably, each counts are different depending on which tradition you're in, but nevertheless, you have a series of books that fall into different categories and have different purposes. You've got epic stories, stories which don't actually have a name and a place and a date in Genesis. You've got history, sometimes very carefully written and chronicled. There's a difference between the chronicle, which is day by day or year by year, king by king in sequence, and we have some unbroken sequences in the Old Testament which are pretty reliable. I always found it interesting when I finished my studies how people who would sniff at what the Bible taught would nevertheless depend on it word for word when they were recreating their historical interpretation of the ancient world. The double standard of finding the Bible absolutely essential to recreate what happened in the world, even as you are deploring what it actually taught. It's also a book of poetry. There's drama. The book of Job is a fantastic old, ancient, classical style of drama. You actually have biographies, law codes, and you have some visionary literature as well, and wisdom literature, all of which often resemble the style of the literature of the day in other cultures because they were part of the general literary world or literacy world of the time. So for me, looking at the Bible, the first thing I have to say is there's two sides to that story. And one of them is what the Bible teaches, what the content of the text actually says, as what it witnesses to in terms of the story of God and the story of God and the human race. At the same time, there's another story that relates to that, but it's a bit different. And that's the history, the biography of the book itself, especially when it comes to the question of reliability. For example, the assumption often is made that the longer after an event the source that records it exists, so let's say there's 10 minutes after an event, you get an eyewitness. 100 years from now, you get a court record made from those eyewitnesses. 300 years from now, you have 5 court records compared and contrast. That the further you get away from an event, the more unreliable the account is. And the assumption was often made right through to the 1950s, and in some cases still is there, that because a manuscript is, say, 1,000 years old, that it cannot possibly be an accurate representation or description of something that occurred 2,000 years before that, because it's too far away from the date. The irony, of course, is that we do that all the time. For example, my old Latin class standby that I had to translate in grade 10, grade 12, second year university, Julius Caesar, Conquest of Gaul. The conquest of Gaul was taking place in the 50s before the Common Era or before Christ. And yet the only accounts or manuscripts by Caesar of his own autobiography come from monasteries and monastic collections in Europe that are probably from 900 AD, almost 1,000 years after the events that Caesar describes in the writings. No one, even after they've analyzed them and assessed them for accuracy, for bias, and so on, no one says, well, we therefore cannot know anything about Caesar. He probably never existed. The same thing is true of other books of the ancient world. In fact, what's often called the literary hypothesis or the book hypothesis is one that the Bible, remarkably, is well buttressed by. We may have 2 good manuscripts of Julius Caesar's Conquest of Gaul. We have 3 or 4 and little books that have survived. We have a few chapters or books of Livy's History of Rome. Books that I worked with, I often was very well aware of the fact that they weren't even complete. Parts of the manuscript had disappeared or been destroyed over history, and that none of the manuscripts I was working with in ancient Roman history were actually within 500 years of the author, 500 years of the events they described. And so we're looking at an act of faith, but one corroborated. And so when you look at something Caesar writes, you check it against the geography, you check it against monuments, and the same thing is true of something like this. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which came in the period that we would say between Babel and Abraham. That's a pretty big jump in the Bible, but nevertheless, it's in that period that the king of Uruk, named Gilgamesh, had epics written about him. He was kind of a Mesopotamian Hercules. And so as a result, people used to say, right up until recently, well, I shouldn't say recently. Recent for a classical historian can be within 100 years. But essentially, Gilgamesh was considered a figment of literature. No possible evidence for him. And then, of course, the city of Uruk was dug, and Gilgamesh's name was found in the king list as one of the great builders, one of the first great kings of that civilization. And that's the challenge with archaeology, which is what I find so fascinating. At this point, archaeological research has now matured beyond the level of finding places that the old critics said didn't exist. Nineveh, of course, was considered a fiction. And then, of course, Dr. Layard went out and found it. The same thing is true of many sites in the ancient world which were considered to be part of fiction or mythology. Those assessments have to be revised because they continually are dug, uncovered, and collated with other discoveries. So the archaeology and the history of the text itself is a remarkable story, and I want to talk eventually about how that transmission of accurate documents, whether you believe the contents or not, I know there may be some watching who are not really in love with the content, nevertheless we can look at the book itself and the literature and the text and discover that in fact there's a fairly strong, reliable transmission of these documents that in some cases goes back 2,000 years. You pick up any of the books of the Old Testament, for example, and even though they describe events that might be 2,000 years before Christ or 2,000 years before the Common Era, as is often said today, the irony is the actual text is unchanged for the last 2,000 years. The great discovery with the first Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were examined, they were discovered beginning in 1947 and have only recently all been released to the public and translated in the last 20 years. It demonstrates that the Old Testament books of the Bible that were there were virtually identical to the text of the Masoretic text and the modern texts of the books of the Old Testament today. You can say, in a sense, that the Bible, the book of Isaiah that Jesus reads from in the synagogue, is unchanged by the year 1000 AD and was unchanged for 200 or 300 years before he read it. And we have the documents now to show the close correspondence between these texts. Well, that suggests a very reliable, accurate, and conscientious attempt to keep the copies accurate and unchanged over time. And, you know, it's true that there have been discrepancies. Explaining the discrepancies can be quite interesting because you know the source, you might know the origin and the bias of the author, and you also have a chance to assess what's a discrepancy and what's a contradiction. Let's take that up right now. Just to introduce a term, the word autograph, which we think of course, as I got a Hollywood star's name on my hockey puck or something. Autograph actually comes from the idea that the document or the source was written by the author themselves. So if Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, it would be nice to have an autograph, a copy of Genesis in Moses' hand with his name on the cover. They don't exist. In fact, nothing that could be written on in that time, vellum, parchment, which are made from animal skins, or papyrus, which comes later and is based on paper made from a reed that grows on the Nile River, none of those sources can last that long without physically disintegrating, especially if they've been touched a lot by human hands. The first thing you discover when you go into an archives, as I learned, is before you touch a single document, you're handed a pair of gloves. Because the oil on your skin, the environment, sometimes the humidity, the bacteria in your breath can begin to break down and degrade these ancient sources, these ancient textiles, these ancient papers and texts. So it becomes quite a remarkable process to protect them from time and age. And although we know that a good parchment scroll can last up to 500 years, and in fact there are Torah scrolls in use today that are close to 500 years of age, they've been very carefully taken care of, almost untouched by human hands, preserved in special containers with special conventions around them. Nevertheless, it is possible for Isaiah to have written a copy of his prophecies, have that parchment last for 500 years, and then have it copied by one of the scribes in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls are located, and have that copy in leather survive, or one of that age or that generation of copying be literally in Jesus' hands when he reads from the scroll in the synagogue in his hometown. In all of these cases, there are very many safeguards, which I'll talk a bit about later, I hope, to show that these documents, which were conceived as divine, there is even in ancient Jewish tradition a teaching that the Torah, the first 5 books, existed before the creation of the world in the mind of God, and lit by fire they supervised the creation of the world, which means that Moses isn't actually creating the first 5 books. He's actually taking a kind of dictation or inspiration. It's a little harder to go with the dictation theory today because we do see style, sometimes word choice, even accents in some of the writing that indicate that the authors themselves had some impact on it. But nevertheless, it means that there's an integrity that comes out of studying the history of the Bible that's worth having a look at. So the first thing is, don't expect every book of the Bible to be the same. They're a library. When you walk into a library, it has different authors. The books are written at different times, and they have different purposes, as I was saying earlier. So it's a good idea when you look at the who, what, when, where, how, and why of the Bible to recognize that it's not all the same. There are different purposes. The 56 books are actually written in 2 different languages. Hebrew, it's interesting, even Hebrew as a language has a history. It's quite likely that Abraham did not speak Hebrew. He wasn't even from a part of Mesopotamia where that language was in use. He probably learned Hebrew, if he used Hebrew much, when he moved to Canaan, which was where Hebrew was born. These kinds of things mean that we have to understand a little bit of the history of what's going on to get a picture of where these languages come from. It's very interesting, for example, that around the time that Abraham and his father Terah move west from Mesopotamia, from Ur, there actually is a series of chaotic invasions and turmoil, which explains there's probably a really good reason for Terah to take Abraham, Sarah, and get out of Dodge and head west into the quieter country away from the Mesopotamian area. And these historical forces, as we come to understand them, also explain some things that are not always laid out in great detail in the Bible, but which make sense and add to the integrity of understanding what the Bible's saying. 2 main languages. 3 other languages actually have input. There's a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Persian, there's Aramaic and Hebrew. And as a result, we have adjustments, vocabulary that slips in from other languages as well. So it means that a familiarity with ancient languages and the history of those languages is critical for translation. Probably for the last 2,000 years, the text of the Old Testament and the text of the New have actually changed very little. There are misspellings. There are occasional sections that are not in one copy or another, and I know that Alan next week will be talking about the ending of Mark, which has 2 textual traditions. Those kinds of things appear, and there are some variations within the text, but by and large, those tend to be relatively minor and almost never change the meaning. This is kind of significant when you look at copying, because you'll see in the safeguards, even in the copies that we have, there are notes in the margin occasionally that show that a scribe has found a copying error, which is marked, although not often is it erased, but marked to be either read more carefully or written more carefully in the future. You may have heard of the tradition of counting the letters and counting the columns of the established text of the Old Testament. And this is a scribal tradition that goes back at least to the century or 2 after the fall of the temple in 70 AD, and is part of the creation of the final Jewish canon, which has its own story as well. But those safeguards mean that when a scribe finishes a text, it goes to examination. And literally counting the letters is one way of determining by human computation whether an extra word or a misspelling or an accent has been added that does not belong there. And those kinds of creations, the number of columns, number of pages, number of words, and number of characters carefully counted, do provide a way to guard against major errors along the way. So let's go with that idea. The other thing is, of course, the Bible's written in 4 or 5 different locations. It has a history. Not all of it was written in Canaan or Israel or Judea. There are parts that clearly were written in Babylon under Persian influence, parts in Egypt. So we have then a tradition where even the book itself got around and was accumulated over time, over centuries, adding up what were considered the witnesses to the story of God and his people. So first of all then, we don't have autographs. But you can sometimes tell what might have come from an autograph in the actual style itself. And for that, I want to bring up a technical point from that I was taught by one of the authors working on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Norman Golb. He pointed out that the thing about an autograph as opposed to a copyist manuscript is that a copied manuscript, so second copy, third copy, fourth copy, they tend to become a little more polished. The writing is more correct. The words tend to be in better grammar. Spelling is more carefully attended to. Autographs tend to rattle a little bit. They're kind of like our notes that we write ourselves. If I were to look at your letters or my letters, when we did write letters that we sent to people, they have a structure. The letters aren't always shaped perfectly. We don't use our best copperplate script. Our cursive handwriting is almost a lost art, but in the days when we did have cursive handwriting, we still made handwriting errors. There were blotches. There were things that indicated that an autograph was raw. It had come out of the hand, out of the head, through the eyes and the hands of a person, and it didn't have that final polish. A copy of that autograph, however, the copyist, the scribe, has an obligation to A, present it in a presentable form, to B, write it carefully, to use specially prepared inks and specially prepared materials, which means that as you read a copy, you can tell often it just looks and reads more nicely because it's a copy. That's why I find it amusing sometimes when critics complain about rough Greek in the New Testament. That to me suggests that it's actually close to an autograph. If the Greek isn't perfect, it's like my writing a letter. Educated as I am, I don't use correct Oxford English when I'm writing a letter to my wife or to my family. And if someone says, boy, his English is rough, that can't have been written by an English speaker, just a minute. That might actually demonstrate that it is an autograph or close to an autograph because it was written for the time, first time. If someone ever were to collect my letters and edit them at some point, they would look a lot different and they would look a lot more nice as well, or nicely. So those are some of the things. Autograph, copy. Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, with a dash of Babylonian, Persian, Ugaritic, don't worry about that one. A Septuagint copy of the Bible in Greek, which was actually widely used by Jews who actually had Aramaic and Hebrew, because when you moved away from Jerusalem, and Jews were moving away from Jerusalem for hundreds of years, thanks to the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and then later on the Greeks and the Romans, often they were using and preferred the scriptures in the local Greek that they were living and speaking every day in the Mediterranean world. So in Alexandria, for example, it made perfect sense not to insist that everyone read the Hebrew Bible, but everyone read the Septuagint, famous translation into Greek, Hellenistic Greek, allegedly by the 70 famous scholars who didn't disagree about translation at all. Something of a miracle if you know how translators work. And my own experience with translation is much the same, although I only worked in Latin, a relatively young dead language. So the result is that we have a variety, we have emphasis, and we have direction. They're not actually historical accounts. There's no attempt to be dispatched, dispassionate, detached. They have a purpose. John writes in the New Testament, I wrote these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God. There's no doubt that all of the books in the Bible, even if they don't name God very often, nevertheless represent the interaction of God with his covenant people. And that's the unique message of the Bible itself, is that it is a record, a testimony, an encyclopedia, a poetry book, a gathering of biographies and novels and wisdom literature, entirely about one people who come from one family, who come out of a period of slavery and a tumultuous breakaway from an empire, one of the great empires of the ancient world, and literally walk and fight their way to a new place that they believe has been promised to them. The result, of course, is a unique testimony of a nation trying to work out its identity and its future, and not always doing a very good job of relating to the very God who they give credit for founding them. But it is a story that actually has a plot. Ancient historiography, to use an old-fashioned word, the schools of interpretation of the ancient world tend to be circular. One thing happens after another. An empire grows strong and rich, and then it becomes corrupt, and then it collapses into chaos, and then another movement or empire or founder comes along. And in the Greek tradition, this means that sometimes the past doesn't matter. It's really remarkable to watch the Egyptians laughing at the ancient Greeks for having no proper historical records of the wars in Troy. They have this poet, Homer, but they don't have any documents, any archival documents. The Egyptians were keeping archives for 1,000 years before the Greek history was even beginning to be recorded. And the Greeks often, in the ancient times, had a bit of a sense of historical inferiority when they went to Egypt, because the Egyptian priests said, we've got this all written down for 1,000 years. You're just guessing about the days of Achilles and Agamemnon. What you've got is mythology, heroic tales. You don't have any documents. We do. And often historians, the Greek historians like Herodotus, when they attend Egypt, they come away kind of regretting the fact that their historical records stop at about 700 BC and only begin all over again as if from scratch after that. The Hebrews are different. They have a continuous story of developing an identity, developing a knowledge of God, of falling away, being called back, of rule by heroes, rule by kings, and eventually the corruption of the kingship and the conquest. But unlike other classical nations, it's not the end of the story. In fact, true to their prophecies and true to their destiny as they see themselves, the Jews return to their land, cured of idolatry by the experience of the exile, and holding on to this idea that out of their future will come the salvation of the world. That's a line. It's a line that can be plotted in a way that no other ancient civilization does. The Hittites had a bit of morality. There was sometimes lessons that could be drawn. Don't anger the gods this way and don't anger the gods that way. There's the epic story of Gilgamesh and the flood that he was supposed to be part of. Those are all there. But they amount to dealing with gods that are capricious, chaotic. In the case of the flood in Gilgamesh's epic, the gods are afraid. They're cowards, running from the flood and totally unable to do anything about it. So we have, therefore, a totally different portrait of God, of the divine world, of the meaning of history. Unlike any other nation in the ancient world, the Bible asserts that the Jewish people, the Israelites, have a history with a profound, all-encompassing meaning. It all matters to this great story of God redeeming not just the Jews, but the human race through them. So those kinds of things mean that we have a whole different shape to the Bible, the biblical story, than we would have in many of the other ancient literature. And even every now and then when you find some ancient literature that looks, oh, that looks like the Bible, often a close comparison reveals the differences are more significant than the similarities. You know, I remember when I was in university, everyone was convinced that, for example, the Gilgamesh Upnapishtim flood sequence was obviously what Moses or whoever was drawing on in the description of the flood of Noah. Everyone simply implied that if something was older and had a similar story, it must somehow have created what came after. The irony, of course, is a close examination of that reveals that the actual characters, the motivation, the worldview are so different, not similar, that they really cannot come from the same religious culture. They might even be talking about a similar event, but the worlds they represent are entirely different and in fact moving in opposite directions. So those kinds of things have taught me a lot about looking at stones and bones in ancient documents and looking at the question of the reliability of the Bible. I think I'll stop for a minute there and see, have there been any questions or any comments by now? All right. Nope.
It doesn't look like any have come in online, no.
Okay, well, hopefully no one's going to sleep yet.
Yep. I have one that I can forward your way.
Sure.
So when you talk about and accusations that some of these stories in the Bible draw on other religious and cultural traditions, and you emphasize that the differences are sometimes more evident than the similarities, Can you give another example of an occurrence, like a story that has comparative stories to other ancient thoughts, where the differences are highlighted in such a way that you know that they've arrived from the same culture, but one wasn't literally influenced by the other? Being the accusation is always that, as I learned that in college, that the Bible is just built on other traditions. It's the same as other traditions. Can you name one of those traditions where, they existed in the same culture, but the Bible didn't depend on this tradition, this story?
Well, let's look at the old idea of covenant, for example.
Yeah.
Cutting covenant is an ancient tradition where you divide the carcass and you say, well, if a covenant is not kept, may what happened to these carcasses be what happens to me. You basically cut covenant, you make a blood oath, and so on, and there are obligations there. And that culture, that kind of practice is widespread through the ancient world of Mesopotamia, the world of that time, along the Euphrates, up the coast, the kind of world of Canaan.
Yes.
Cutting covenant that way was not unknown. The significance, though, is that in this case, the covenant is a covenant which is not directly realized, but is maintained as this symbol, a creed for those people that has a global significance even beyond the existence of Abraham. Sure, you might say Abraham's method looks very similar to one being used by a Hittite or perhaps somebody in northern Canaan or in Haran. But of course, the message of the covenant in the case of Abraham is of a significance and of an intention and of a character of a God that is totally different from the capricious, selfish, deceptive, often we would say immoral gods and goddesses of that time who may have made covenants here and there, betrayed them, or had to be held to them by the hero who cuts the covenant. It's just the difference of the morality. Much like the stories of the gods in Egypt. And you look at the way in which people say, well, Moses perhaps communicated to Akhenaten the possibility of a single god, and it would be the sun god, and Akhenaten was the heretic pharaoh who created this world, which lasted two generations and then was wiped out, and Egypt tried to forget this heresy.
Yeah.
And you see there that Sigmund Freud, I think, made the suggestion that it was Moses who had communicated monotheism to Akhenaten. Problem, of course, is that it doesn't take the sun god, the Aton, is not the same as Yahweh. There is no covenant, there's no relationship, there's no sense of a moral guidance to the Aton that there is to Yahweh. And so we see that the quality makes the differences so great that you can't see them coming from the same source, the same religious teaching, the same religious culture. In fact, if anything, if Yahweh does anything in the Old Testament, it tends to be something that might look familiar but isn't, because it goes off in a whole different direction with a purpose, dealing with that great plot line of the redemption of the human race through the Jews. So you look closely at the story, you realize after a while, no, they don't come from the same source, they don't come from the same purpose, Much like the story of the ancient age of religion. Because of evolutionary thinking and the idea that history accumulates, and history does accumulate, but the idea that religion accumulates has some interesting aspects or elements. For example, people say, well, an ancient religion must have ancient temples. An ancient religion must have ancient monuments. And in fact, many of the world religions do, although some of them are relatively recent, But what's interesting is if you have a religion and a relationship with a God that depends on animal sacrifice and not temples, animal sacrifice, and in the case of Abraham, a migration pattern of wandering, a period of captivity or suppression in Egypt, none of these leave monuments. There are no monuments. In fact, the first monument, you might say, is the Temple of Solomon. So in a sense, we have a people that have existed with an identity and a thrust through history. They turn up in funny places in the records of other nations, but actually have no monument. which is why when they maybe claim they have the oldest religion, it might be quite probable, because the oldest religion would leave the fewest remains.
Right.
So you flip the paradigm and you begin to realize, hey, wait a minute, some of our thinking is based so much on our modern idea of evolution, accumulation, progress, that we might actually miss the point of some of the, how to interpret some of these ancient documents as well.
Yes.
We have one family who has one son, one clan evolves out of that, and eventually one people. And then that one people eventually develop a king and a monarchy, which fails. And yet out of that promise comes another monarchy. And then you go to the New Testament, and what you see Matthew laying out is, well, guess what? We have one family, one son, one new people, a clan, you might say, of 12, which becomes a new people, the church. And again, it's that residence that gives the New Testament its cumulative power to interpret the Old, which is why I am bringing in the New Testament at this point, because you'd almost think we're only talking about the Old Testament tonight.
Yes.
Anything coming up on the question round?
I don't know. It doesn't look like we have any online questions coming through. I suggest maybe just move on to some of the more challenges to the historical reliability of the Scripture, and addressing some of those challenges that people may have heard before.
So let's talk a bit more about this chain of reliability or chain of transmission of documents.
Yes.
Okay. For example, if you have a document and you want to protect it from being altered, if you have a document and you want to guard against adulteration, twisting, falsification, you have to build safeguards in. And one of the most common ones was the scribal ones I was mentioning, where you literally match every letter and count them and so on. And if you find mistakes, you actually mark them so that the next copyist can avoid them and people who read them aren't led astray. That kind of work comes from a group of people who are dedicated to the idea that the document is the Word of God, and therefore to alter it or modify it, even to help it, would be falsification,
right,
a violation of the sacredness of the document. And we actually have a group of people, priests and scribes, the scribes are called sofarim, who were dedicated to copy and to guard the text from alteration. We know there were libraries by the time of David and Solomon. If you were to look at the period of the Kings and Chronicles, you'll actually find references to these other books. You often see it, and as for the deeds of so-and-so, are they not recorded in this chronicle, and so on. And no one questions the fact that actually there are probably a dozen other written accounts that were sitting in the library of David's palace or the library of the temple. And David and Solomon, we know, both had named and defined scribal libraries and copy sessions going on.
And you say no one questions this?
No, no, really.
Secular or religious?
You'll have debates, of course, and scholars never agree on everything.
Yes.
But nevertheless, it's very difficult not to see a high probability.
Right.
You know, we don't get certainty very often.
No, and when people debate, it's not about certainty, it's about likelihood.
Yeah, because after all, if I find a document that says the 100 Years' War started today, I know it's a forgery.
Yes.
Because nobody knew it was going to be 100 years.
Yeah.
But the same thing is true of some of these texts. You look at them and you realize, okay, so this appears to be brought together by several accounts. Well, most of the historical books are not authored. There's no author's name on them. They're anonymous. But they're nevertheless trying to build that chronicle of one year after another year after another year. And we have unbroken chains with names of scribes and names of authors in the Old Testament, especially during the period with the temple and right through to the final coming of the Babylonians and the Assyrians to cart everybody off. That suggests then that there's a culture of scribes who are known and who are held accountable to maintain accurate records.
Right.
There are some wonderful stories of what that means to. The classic one in Jeremiah is the poor scribe Baruch, who we know existed, by the way, because we've got independent verification. We actually,
what do you mean by independent verification?
well, archaeology. People say, well, Baruch maybe never existed. Well, we actually have the seals that were put on documents by him that have been identified, translated in a room of seals. Clearly that had been a library and perhaps the parchments had burned up, but the seals are clay and they bake. And there they are with Baruch's name on them.
Yep.
So we have that, you know. And it's like finding Gilgamesh's name on the king list of Erech. Suddenly he's not a myth anymore, he's a figure. By the way, the same thing is true of David. When I was in university in the 70s, everybody knew that David was almost like a trade name for a war chief that nobody believed existed.
Right.
Now we actually have documents, archaeological verification, and that's what I find so much fun about the verification by archaeology. You don't get proof that God did this, but you get proof that these people existed in this place at the time that the Bible says they were doing what they were doing what they were doing. And those kinds of moments give you that sense that the world of that time has been accurately described. Luke is another historian who, in his Gospel and in Acts, is so accurate in describing the titles of the Roman officials that classical scholars of the first century unfailingly have shown that the titles he uses for each of the Roman officials are so accurate that they use those titles to reconstruct the administrative nature of the Roman Empire at the time. Things like the censuses when they were taken, those now have been checked out carefully and discovered that, oh yeah, they did actually happen the way Luke recorded them. So you look at that, you begin to realize that, to go back to the Old Testament, there's an archives with scribes in scrolls, copying with rules of textual quality, the rules that were taken over later on by the Masoretes when it came to the proper pronunciation of the Hebrew. And that these actually have been followed right through to the coming of the copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are about 200 BC when they were written and then carefully hidden before the Roman army showed up in 70 AD. So what I'm talking about is corroboration.
Yes.
You know, if it looks like a duck, talks like a duck, walks like a duck, and I've got the bill, then we know it was a duck. Yep. Now, did that duck believe in Yahweh? Who can tell? But they wrote that they did, and we know they existed in the time and place that they said they did. That leads us to a highly probable understanding that the attempt of the author was to be accurate and representative. So those kinds of things, my life has been a process of uncovering bit by bit more and more of this, and beginning to understand that sometimes we actually have to go back. You know, sometimes a general in a campaign has to retreat before he can go ahead, find another approach. That does mean that reinterpretation of some of these scriptures does happen. You know, the more we do research, the more we realize sometimes that when we thought, oh, well, this is when they did this, they were thinking that, we actually are using our more modern assumption to understand their motivation.
Can I bring up another question?
Yes, sorry.
By way of example. As well with when you're talking about corroboration. So what you're saying is that the literature, the biblical literature, is held under the same historical scrutiny as other ancient literature.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And some of the challenges that have happened in the past that may be brought up in universities or other scholarly avenues may have been dealt with in the last 30, 40, or 50 years. Some of the stuff that was brought up in the early 1900s or the late 1800s.
Yes, absolutely.
What would you, as far as recent archaeology or recent challenges to, do you know of any recent challenges where a reinterpretation and based on archaeology of ancient Near Eastern thought and of literature, both New Testament and Old, can you think of any current challenges which are requiring some additional scrutiny from scholars who are believing in the message that the Bible is telling? That's causing us trouble that these guys are addressing actually quite intelligently currently.
Well, let me put it this way. When I was reading material in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1970s at the University of Western Ontario, we were working with the first scrolls that had been translated, which, by the way, Canadians paid for.
Yeah.
It was McGill University that provided the funds to buy the Dead Sea Scrolls and provide them. That's why Canadians have always had a kind of close relationship with the Dead Sea Scrolls Project.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, when those scrolls came out, they were carefully, closely guarded, and interpreted by a group of people that very quickly accepted the idea and promoted the idea that the community that guarded the Dead Sea Scrolls were in fact a group of monkish Essenes.
Yeah.
And that they were creating a scriptorium where they would be writing and so on. And it took until the 1980s and 90s for the controversy over their slow release of these documents reached the point where they were finally opened widely to the public. And you might say that the Dead Sea Scrolls ceased to be a trade secret that was carefully controlled by this mythology of the monkish Essenes.
Yeah.
And became a much more wide open study of them as documents, which means, as far as I'm concerned, anything you read about the Dead Sea Scrolls that was written before 1990 has to be weighed with a kilogram of salt.
Yep.
A grain of salt is not enough.
Yep.
Because those interpretations were guarded by a hypothesis that's under increasing debate,
Yep.
some by Norman Golb, someone that I was reading in the 90s. But whether you accept Golb's hypothesis, that this actually was a library gathered from Jerusalem before the Romans came and then hid out there and had very little to do with the Qumran community, whether you accept that or not, nevertheless, the idea that somehow these were proto-Catholic monks hiding in the desert, copying out scrolls in plain song going on at the time, just doesn't hold water anymore.
Yep.
And the new scholarship is really quite remarkable. In fact, I was on sabbatical in Edinburgh in 1998, and the Dead Sea Scroll display was brought to Glasgow in keeping with the Dead Sea Scrolls conference that was held at New College at Edinburgh. So I couldn't go to the conference because I didn't have time, but I did get over to Glasgow to look at the Dead Sea Scroll display.
Yep.
And you stand there, in 2 minutes, you can tell that the community itself is based around a fortress.
Yep.
You know, it's based around a strong point, a tower. And so somehow, whatever's going on there, it may have been, in fact, a garrison that was adopted by by whoever lived there as a place to take care of holy things,
Yep.
but not as a monastery before monasteries existed. So there's another example of how we've had to rethink. And it means that a lot of what Christians wrote in good faith about the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls somehow having any influence on John the Baptist or Jesus,
Yeah.
just because it was in the wilderness, it must have been, they had baptism, it must be somehow a linear connection. And that theory has been pretty much shot to pieces now.
Yeah. And what you're saying is that there are new challenges arising to the historicity of Scripture, but there is also new answers being given
Yes.
by people and some of these challenges are brought forth by Christians,
Yeah.
and not just by and
Absolutely.
saying, we're reading this differently, let's go find the answer. So that's being constantly scrutinized.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of evidence now that when you begin to put it together, there's the Jewish writings, sure, and the copies of the Jewish writings, which now we can take back as accurate to 200 BC,
Yeah.
and we can speculate that their root documents were widely known and carefully protected and guarded and gathered 800 years before that.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, for example, to see Moses having gathered and penned a draft of the first 5 books, because we know that writing was common. In fact, Moses probably knew, as a part of the Egyptian civilization, probably 5 alphabets.
Oh, wow.
And there may have been, in fact, 8 languages circulating in Egypt at the time. So we're looking at a much richer world than we thought at the time. But again, there's no autograph by Moses.
Yes, which you definitely explained before,
Yeah.
and how the autographs are pretty much non-existent and how to recognize them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, that's where Alan would say the trick now is to understand how those texts were put together and the
Yeah.
interpretation of them.
I don't know if we have any more questions. Any questions from online? You betcha. I believe we may be able to address one that might have come up. I think we're just going to wait for it to come up here. While we're waiting for that, Duff, do you have? I guess while we're waiting for that, maybe I'll just interrupt you when it does come up.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Okay.
But if you want to move along to maybe to your next point, something to do with, again, some of the challenges that have arisen to this, and some of the things that you've learned in your own historical studies. I know most of our viewers know who you are, but some who may not may know that your entire field of study is in history.
Yeah.
And that's your postdoc graduate work and your professional work as a professor.
Well, that's a good point when it comes to understanding the Bible, because as we know, the Bible has generated more books than any other book in the world.
Yeah.
And that means that theologians, historians, and others have gone through and struggled with not only what the original text was, but what that actually means. And that means that there's been all kinds of interpretations over the years, depending on whether you believe in miracles or not, whether you take the idea that Judaism evolves out of the other religions, as I was saying, a kind of evolutionary success. But for me, one of the interesting things has been the way in which, as we understand the stuff that we've got, the artifacts. I mean, I've actually held a few in my hands. I've looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments that were put on display, and you begin to put them together with what other scholars say. You begin to realize that we're piecing together a puzzle, and that puzzle has at the heart of it a place, and that's what we call the Holy Land.
Yes.
And that place is where the puzzle pieces start to come together. You know, we can find a synagogue in Capernaum, exactly where it's supposed to be. Now, was it one that Jesus and Peter used? Does the house that you go to visit as a tourist, that's Peter's house in Capernaum? We know that it's not possible to find, for example, his deed or a coin or an inscription with his name on it. And if we did, it would probably be a forgery.
Yeah.
Simply because that's what happens, right, with those sites. It's like all those places where George Washington slept during the American Revolution, whether he would, But on the other hand, the idea that there was an intensely controversy-ridden battle for piety there, that the place was a land of hope and hate at the same time, that there was massive followings of Messiah-like figures, means that in some ways we can understand that in that intense environment, Jesus comes and begins to raise hope in spite of himself, and at the same time self-fulfill the old prophecies. Creates a problem politically for the Romans, and I know how Romans work. I studied the Roman system really well. They had a system called the cursus honorum, the course of honors or ranks. And so to be a pilot, you had to go through 7 or 8 previous postings, army, diplomatic, administrative, throughout the empire. So someone, a procurator like Pilate, would have actually been in so many places, much like our senior officers are in the military. They've served in so many different places at different levels, that you didn't have to have telephones and radios like we do today to give orders. Every Roman governor knew exactly what they had to do with someone like Jesus. It was just, you didn't even have to think about it. You knew the procedure. You'd seen it practiced by your superiors in maybe Achaia or in Egypt or some other place, especially in the Middle East, where messiahs came out of the woodwork and did various nasty things and had to be eliminated. So for Pilate to know what to do with Jesus, he knew instantly, because there was no other way to think about it than the way he'd been trained. The trick was, how were you going to arrange so that the guilt did not fall on Rome?
And I guess that's one of the further proofs of the historical nature of the Bible, is that even though it is written for a purpose, it's rooted in an event, and this event being corroborated by the analysis of the behavior of the characters.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the corroborations, is that they behave in expected ways, and when they don't behave in expected ways, as they are described in the Bible, that a lot of that has been corroborated as plausible by historians. So
you actually have the Christian writings, but you have the anti-Christian writings. Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius. You have the writers who are determined, Plutarch, to discredit the Christians, and yet they can't help but say, oh yeah, by the way, Nero tortured them, and it made Rome sick.
Rooted in historical.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, we even have confirmation under the Emperor Claudius, that he kicked all the Jews who followed Chrestus out of Rome.
Yeah.
And sure enough, guess who turns up as a refugee from Rome? Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth when Paul is there.
Yeah.
So you can begin to piece together from these little points that the actual history of the non-Christians actually verifies the chronology and the itinerary
Yes.
of some of these people as well.
I don't know if our question's available to us. Let's read it out here. How do we know that those who translated the scripture believed in God? And maybe I should parentheses that. Is it important that they did?
Well,
is it important to the reliability of scripture that those who translated believed in God?
first thing you think about is you're growing up in a religious culture where, as you're recording and then eventually translating, there is a need as a translator to be authentic to the text.
Yeah.
And the Bible Society actually has produced some tremendous little articles on how translations work. And there's been some really good work because of the different translations emerging and all the controversies about what motivates translation.
Yeah.
And it is possible as a non-believer to say, my mission here is to do a perfectly accurate translation of the book of Acts. And we do actually have a couple of non-Christian translations which stand up really well because of the professional standard.
Yeah.
And the fact that because scholars do things in the open now, to throw out a translation that's clearly flawed or biased is to invite ridicule, and it'll end your employment, it'll make you unemployable. It becomes the kind of book that people, oh, that one. And scholars don't live for that. There are propaganda books that are written. There's spurious, as we call them, gospels and epistles. Yeah. There's certainly where groups of people who wanted to add to the Bible, Gnostics in particular. Yeah. There are others who felt that the Bible was too restrictive. Marcion thought it was too Jewish. Other people thought it was too Greek. And so you do have the church working through what is authentic and what is extra helping, right?
Yep.
But I think the problem with translation these days is not so much do the translators believe, and by and large 99% are believers. The question is, how has the language evolved to make it a translation that people can get the most out of? The real challenge now is, do we want a dynamic equivalent that gives us a sense of the emotion, the faith, the spiritual energy, or do you want a dry, grammatically correct, technical translation that sometimes, you take the King James Version, which actually has a life of its own, but it's 17th century. It was commanded from the Vulgate, which, by the way, if you're translating the Vulgate, keep a copy of the King James Bible handy. It'll really help you at times when you're in a hurry. All undergraduate students know that when they're translating the Vulgate, they keep a King James handy because they depend on each other, even though they're 1,000 years apart. Yeah. But nevertheless, what I'm saying now is the biggest battle is English is changing. And now what do we do with, for example, expressions, references that occasionally come up with colloquialisms. And of course, as our language evolves, there are whole new words that, would that communicate the meaning? Or would that end up making people say, well, that was obviously a 2020 translation. And too topical a translation dates like mad. Almost nobody reads the Cotton Patch Bible anymore. Yes. Which in the 1950s and 60s was a Bible for the civil rights movement. But not anymore. And that's the challenge with translations.
Just to address the questioner, hopefully we're doing justice to this question. If you want to send some follow-up comments, we are addressing in a very specific way the textual differences in Scripture next week. So what that's going to do is perhaps address your translation question and some of the challenges and problems of translation and the nature of the translators themselves. Duff's done a very good job at explaining how one of the reliability pillars of Scripture, I believe, is the integrity of the translators, in that they wanted to preserve the divine nature of the document as they so believed. So I don't know if that's where your question came from. and hence my reframing of it. Hopefully that's doing you justice. But if you'd like to send us some follow-up comments, we will definitely further address that next week.
I'm glad you brought that up, though, because it goes back to the oral tradition as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the assumption here is that there are stories passed on from memory and passed on through believing communities. And the way we know in traditional cultures, including Canadian Indigenous cultures, is that there's oral tradition that you're allowed to adjust, moral stories, bedtime stories, whatever. Yeah. But there's other stories which cannot be altered, and if you change them, you'll be called on it by the community.
Can you elaborate on that, Duff? Where oral traditions, especially when we think of the Gospels, or that we think of stories out of the Pentateuch, of Moses did this, or Aaron did this, and we know that nobody's sitting there writing it down and taking an eyewitness account of it. That this is a story that has been passed on either directly by the eyewitness or through a number of people.
Well, we know genealogies, for example,
Yeah.
in most traditional cultures are sacred.
Yeah.
You do not alter genealogies, even if today we don't understand them.
Yeah.
And it's quite true that the genealogies we have in the Bible often seem to skip a few generations for the sake of symmetry.
Yeah.
You don't change them. And that same thing is true here. In traditional cultures, you don't change boundary stories.
Yeah.
You don't change war stories. And you certainly are not permitted by the community to change the stories that are sacred or identical, formative. Let's use that word.
Yeah.
Formative to identity and objective,
Yeah.
That's why we do know that in the case of the scribes as well, who are writing down and passing on, these weren't done in private. There was no way you could keep a publishing secret in these places because everyone read it. Your superiors, and often scribes, were rigidly controlled by an authoritarian structure. You didn't want to mess with the chief scribe.
Yeah.
They beat scribes in those days for being careless, right? And there's a sense in which you see this ferocious desire to protect it. And professional pride, community identity, your own reputation, all these things are constraints on falsification, especially the idea that, and this comes up in the New Testament with the books of the Bible as well, if you're coming up with something that is clearly deviant and does not add to the narrative, and in fact no one else supports but your little group or one little cult or something like that, it's going to be discarded because it's simply too far outside the norm of the community. The community guards the acceptability of their story.
Yeah.
And that's something we've learned to respect in indigenous cultures. And it's certainly, if you look at the Bible, you can see that things were often done in public.
Yeah.
These are public documents. To falsify them or to deviate is only possible now in a literate culture that's so literate and so profligate, where scholarship is so plentiful and widespread, and communication is so widespread that we can overwhelm people with spurious or falsification or speculative theories, and who's got time to track them all down?
Right.
We have to trust scholars now more than we could trust them in the old days. They didn't always have to trust them in the days when everybody knew the story and read it themselves. And we know literacy in the case of the Jews is pretty widespread. It's quite possible that the patriarchs, Abraham probably went to a literacy academy in Ur as a boy.
Yeah.
And then the tradition of passing on literacy through your sons for the sake of inheritance, property, legitimacy, and so on, means that the Jews were among the most literate ethnic group in the ancient world from the time of Abraham on.
Yeah.
And we do find touch points. Most of the propaganda statements that have survived of Assyria, of Sumer, of Egypt, you'll find the references to these people that indicate that they do appear in the place we expect them to appear.
Right.
And the archaeology is remarkable. We do have two big controversies. One is who was the Pharaoh in charge when Moses led the people out?
Yeah.
Do you know that pharaohs didn't have names attached to them until 700 BC?
I did not know that.
I didn't either. I was just going through this thinking, how come we never know the name of the pharaoh? And the answer is they weren't named that is something applied to them. Their name was not widely published, and we didn't even know, in a sense, the dates until an Egyptian priest back in the old days created the first Egyptian king list, which was so detailed that it was our only way of dating until recently.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for a pharaoh with a name, Shishak, who is named in the later prophetic writings, is the first one with a name that everybody knew.
Yeah.
Up until then, it was just Pharaoh. Now, we have names for them now, but it wasn't widely published at the time. So who was the Pharaoh? There's two guesses. Probably not Ramses from the movie Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's Hollywood, and it's good. It's very persuasive. And people have followed that theory that Ramses was the Pharaoh of the Exodus for a long time. But the archaeology suggests a couple hundred years earlier, which goes with a different way of counting the years. Yeah. And that character has no name, except maybe he might be, this is really obscure, Amenhotep II. He looks more like the warlike, inconsistent, and extremely vengeful pharaoh that would fit the profile,
yeah.
And archaeologically. But again, that's new archaeology.
Yeah.
And it's one that makes people think quite a bit. I have a friend who dug Hatzor, the old fortress town, when he was an archaeology student back in the 60s, right? And we were sharing stories in Kingston back in the 80s. And along with the stories of flies and heat and exhaustion and bad water and everything else, he said the problem is that the later date, they can't find any burned cities.
Oh, wow.
So that's a problem. In fact, the reinterpretation of Joshua is a major move in the last decade or so in Old Testament studies. There may have been an awful lot of less genocide, ethnocide, and terrorism in the conquest than we thought.
Yes. Yeah, that's a big topic now.
Yeah.
I believe that was probably us finishing up for the night and going back and forth with a few questions at the end. As I said, next week we'll be visiting somewhat this topic from a much detailed perspective in some of the text itself, and not as much as the history. So if you do have more questions from tonight's stream, then please put them down, and we'll do our best to answer them. As well as please join us next week for a discussion with our Pastor Alan about the text and the reliability of the text of the Bible. Hopefully this has been raising more questions for you. It's hard to go over the detail in such a small amount of time. Books and books and books and books and debates and debates and debates have been held on this topic. And the main point of this is to convey the purpose that, yes, this has been studied. Yes, these challenges have been answered. Yes, these challenges have been intelligently debated by those who believe in God. And yes, people who have done these studies are very confident in their faith based on the reliability of Scripture. And it's hard to get from an hour, but please follow up individually. Mm-hmm. Ask for resources. See that there has been much study on this. Please join us next week. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, make contact and pass on any questions you have. Thank you, Mike.